Welcome to the workshop. Before we get started with this San Martin Milsub homage review, I wanted to just touch on some conflicting information that I've been hearing, and that's the number of clicks in this bezel, whether it's a 90 click or a 120 click bezel. I can tell you that in my case, it's certainly 120. So that would be 120 divided by 12, that's 10 clicks per indice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I don't know if there's multiple cases out there, or maybe it's just possible repeating of incorrect information. God knows that I've done it, but this one is 120 clicks. What's this dive bezel about anyways? It's to time your elapsed time when you're underwater, and it only turns in one directional, hence the unidirectional. But let's talk about clicks a little bit. Why are those important, and what kind of different bezels do you have with different numbers of clicks? Let's start with the most basic, which would be 60 clicks. This is a smaller sized Tandorio diver, by the way, on a Hadley Roma rubber strap. Here we have one position for each minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the way all of these work is the interior of the bezel has teeth like a gear, and that rides along a ratcheting spring. The advantage of this one with 60 clicks is simplicity. So 60 minutes, 60 teeth match 60 minutes, and it's the easiest to produce and therefore the cheapest. The downsides are the feel. This one definitely feels a bit more clunky, but mainly with 60 teeth, you're much less likely to have a good precise alignment. So that's something to keep in mind if it's really going to bug you. But 60 clicks would be considered the correct budget choice. Next is the redheaded stepchild of the family, this time on this Suzaku diver from a couple of reviews back, and that is a 90 click bezel. If you think about it, 90 divided by 12 is 7.5, and you can't have half of a tooth on a gear. So it means that your bezel is not necessarily going to correspond to where your indices are. Some are going to line perfectly, and others are going to be pretty poor. So if you see on the first one, we're a bit behind. The next, we're a bit ahead. And then at 9 o'clock, we're bang on. The upside is that these are cheap and easy to manufacture, like the 60 click, while feeling a bit more premium. The action is definitely a bit more positive. And I gotta be honest, the 90 click thing, that does bug me. But even I have to admit that there is a place in terms of feeling better than the 60 click and being cheaper to produce than the 120 click. Wrapping up with the subject of this review, I hope we can agree that this is a 120 click bezel. Now, is it San Martin's best of all time? I don't think so, but if you stick around later in the review, I will compare it to my favorite from the brand. The benefit of 120 clicks is that the math works out and it does feel the most premium. But you are going to pay for that. It's the most expensive to produce. And even if you're going with a Japanese or a Swiss brand, that isn't going to guarantee perfect alignment, because at the end of the day, it's a person that's assembling these components. Great segue to the nitty-gritty. This was an emotional roller coaster for me. As you can see, I did get a good price on this on the November 11/11 sale. My cost is on the left, next to the current price, which is approximately $176 versus $200 US. But that 90 click rumor really spoiled the wait for me. Even if it was a pleasant surprise on arrival, when I was waiting for this watch, I was already thinking, can I move it on? This watch is a collaboration between San Martin and the retailer watchdives.com. The style is nicknamed Milsub, after a 1957 variation of that very famous dive watch produced for the Ministry of Defense. Namely, we have sword hands and a full minute scale on the bezel. In my view, this is the best use of an homage. It's by no means an original design, but at the same time, this is not a copy of a modern watch, more an interpretation of a famous classic using modern construction and materials. And back on the watch, we have a sapphire crystal with a slight dome and anti-reflective coating that's going to give a slight blue sheen to the otherwise black dial. This, unlike previous San Martins I've looked at, has a slightly glossier dial, and I like it. It's kind of high-end. But unfortunately, what's not so high-end is This little speck of dust on the dial there. And I am typically very forgiving about this sort of QC issue at this price point, but that's visible to the naked eye and bears mentioning. Once we're done with the overview here, I'll compare it to my SN045. That's the watch from my very first video and my first San Martin diver. This is kind of more old school San Martin, and this is one of the newer Watch Dives collaborations, but there's some interesting contrast to be drawn here. They've definitely improved some features, but at the same time, they've cut a few corners. Non-scientific view of the lume. I'll spare you the details because it comes from the same supplier and it's the same compound, except that the blue has that beautiful color and slightly lighter indices in daylight, but it's not as strong as the green on the right. So it's really up to what you prefer. San Martin remains strong with the dial details, indices, and printing, I think especially. The blue lume has a nice cream color in daylight, and that's applied on these very brightly polished markers. I think that they match the curve of the crystal very nicely. And while it is a bit blingy along with the busyness of the bezel, I think that matches the vintage minimalism of the dial printing. And we do have the printed hexagon logo that matches the outer printed minute track here, as well as the 200 meters stated water resistance and automatic, this being an NH35 Epson movement. For hands, let's get that reflection. We do have the sword shape, and I prefer this to Mercedes or snowflake style hands, and it's really amazing how a little preference like that can really make or break the model for you. Being an NH35, there is a ghost position, but I do like the crown. It's wide enough to be grippy, and at the same time doesn't protrude too far from the case. The diameter is compact at 38 millimeters, but the bezel is actually 40 millimeters, so on wrist it doesn't feel undersized. The lug-to-lug is also likewise very wearable, 46 millimeters, and while it is 13 millimeters thick, a surprising amount of that is the domed crystal. If you see, the case profile is actually quite thin behind that largest bezel, and coming in at 151 grams sized for my wrist. So if you're looking for a watch in this size and this style anyways, I think you're going to be a lot happier with the San Martin long term than some of the cheaper options. Though the Watch Dives version, this one, is by far the best value. And even with there's watches in the same case and the same movement, but I guess with that retailer, they were just able to order more higher quantity and lower that unit price. But I have to leave it there, guys, and we can save the comparison for part 2. We can also talk about the AliExpress sale that is coming up on March 20th. So I would save any of your purchases until then, and we can talk about anything that looks interesting. But thanks for watching, and I will see you soon. What? That does not work.